Hi everyone, hello.
Hey, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. Welcome.
Hello, Raven. Hi, Kobe. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Gobi.
Okay, I'm gonna get off messaging.
So quick questions, Daniel. So should I say that this event is jointly supported by the Wolf Institute and the Brooklyn College Department of Philosophy?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Just to make sure, because there are a lot of names on the flyer.
Yeah.
A lot of
And
sponsors.
yeah, those are. You could mention also the Philosophy Society, which is our student club. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we can start whenever you like, because it's 12:31. So,
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So hello, everybody. Welcome to this session, Why Study Asian Philosophy. So we have the honor to host this event, and this event is jointly supported by the Wolf Institute, the Brooklyn College Department of Philosophy, as well as the Brooklyn College Philosophy Society. So before we start, I would like to make an acknowledgement. So Brooklyn College is located on land that is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kernisi and Lenape people, land enriched by the blood of enslaved Africans. We, the Brooklyn College community, acknowledge that academic institutions, indeed the nation state itself, was founded upon and continues to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous and Black peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle ongoing practices and legacies of settler colonialism, and to recognize the hundreds of indigenous nations who continue to resist and live on these lands. We pay our respect to indigenous and other elder past, present, and future. Thank you. So today we have the honors of welcoming two speakers. So the first speaker we're going to hear today is Professor Hagop Sarkisian, professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at Baruch College. His research is in the moral psychology and Chinese philosophy, especially the classical era around 6th to 2nd century BCE. He also works in metaethics and cognitive science of religion, using resources from other relevant disciplines, such as evolutionary biology and experimental psychology. We'll also be hearing from Professor Saam Trivedi, professor in the Department of Philosophy at Brooklyn College. Professor Trivedi has studied philosophy at universities in the US, England, and India. His interests cut across philosophical aesthetics, Eastern philosophies, metaphysics, and the philosophy of mind. So each speaker will give us a brief talk, about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to welcome questions and comments from all of you. So Professor Hagop Sarkisian, please take the floor whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much. So I was thinking about what to say, and obviously I do this professionally, and I've bought into the study of Asian philosophy wholeheartedly, and I thought to share some of the reasons why I got into the field. But I think I'm happy to leave that for Q&A, and I thought, well, if folk are here listening, then maybe I'll share a little bit by way of introducing a couple of ideas from classical Chinese philosophy, in particular classical Confucianism, so that you can walk away with a little bit of an enrichment and enriched understanding of at least one aspect of one tradition in Asian philosophy. So I will share a slideshow at this point. So let me see if I'm going to do this correctly. I will share my screen. Okay. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. Okay, just give me 1 second here. All right. So I thought I would start with an example of how I think the study of Chinese philosophy has helped me as a philosopher. And I'm going to do this by way of talking about some of what I'll call the focal points of ethical reflection. So I borrow this idea of a focal point or a point of focus from Shelley Kagan, a philosopher at Yale, who notes that whatever one's foundational assumptions in ethics or one's sense of what are the generally relevant factors that to like the focal point or the focus point upon which one is going to focus one's ethical theorizing. So I'll give you a couple of examples just to make the idea vivid. So ethics can, of course, be about actions, and I think this will be very obvious, right? So ethics can reflect on questions like, did X do what is right? How can we determine whether we ought to do, say, action A or action B? Or how can we know whether A is right or wrong, permissible or impermissible? Different theories will use different devices, okay, to generate or evaluate and apply sort of normatively relevant factors in deciding whether or not an action is right or wrong. So famously, there's these principle-based approaches in Western ethics where an individual, say, has a question about what to do, and they can apply a principle, say the principle of utility. This principle will then tell you what you should do in terms of choices of action. Similarly, you can have a competing principle, say the categorical imperative. And once you apply this principle to the question at hand, it's supposed to yield to you a course of action. Now, these principles focus on very different things. So the principle of utility tells us, like when you and I are facing a choice about whether to do, say, A or B, what we ought to do is like focus on the consequences that will result from our choices of those actions, and then look at the how much goodness or pleasure or happiness is generated by those actions. And that's what determines which action we should take. The categorical imperative, it's another approach in the history of philosophy. It says, no, instead what we ought to do is look at people's intentions and how they intend to treat others in coming up with their action. So actions are like one possible focus point of ethical theorizing. And it's a very popular approach in Western philosophy. But then like there's this other approach which says, no, like if we want to really sort of get to the heart of what's important in terms of morality, we should focus on agents and what kind of people we want to be. Okay, so when you take this approach, it's exemplified by this idea called virtue ethics, okay? And you trade in ideas like what is human excellence and what does that consist of? How can I be wise and how can this wisdom help inform my life? What practical wisdom is? And what, at the end of the day, can we describe as a flourishing life? So again, this is like a possible focus point, okay? So you're interested in like moral questions, and you're like, what we should do is focus on the nature of persons. So when what I study, which is classical Confucian philosophy quite a bit, this approach has been taken. So there are texts that have been published that compare Confucianism as a kind of virtue ethics. Now, for me as a philosopher, when I read these classical texts in early Confucianism, I'm interested in like, what are they focusing on? And I don't mean to deny that my colleagues who have written these fantastic books have real insights and capture some truth when they say that early Chinese philosophers are interested in what kind of people we should be. But it's sort of like obvious to me when I read these texts that they're fascinated by the role of influence in human life. And they're fascinated by the fact that you and I as people, like every day, like when we walk out the door, we're subject to influence from our environments, from the people we're interacting with. And this influence that it has on our behavior, it's kind of subtle and we might not notice it, but if you observe it correctly, you'll be able to tell. So this is like this alternative approach, I think, to ethical theorizing that I found really important in my own life. And at the end, I'm going to say a little bit about what that is, practically speaking. And it might give you an example of how thinking about the nature of influence might be important to you. So why do they think about this? Well, these classical thinkers take this bird's eye view and they look at society. And what they see is that from this bird's eye perspective, you can see whole populations of individuals sort of being moved this way or that to good or bad behavior owing to their circumstances. So that's kind of like the influence of your circumstances. So there's this classical thinker named Mencius, and he remarks that, in years of plenty, most young people are gentle, but in years of poverty, most young men are violent, right? And he says it's not owing to their natures that they become either gentle or violent, right? It's their circumstances that allow their minds to be captured. Right. So there's this idea that you have to be really careful of the circumstances you're in because they can shape your behavior one way or another. I'll skip this quote. So there's this like general focus on the fact that your situations can shape your behavior. And this has been like capturing the attention of moral philosophers in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy for the last 20 years under this idea of situationism. So situationism, just like these early Confucian thinkers, maintains that morally significant behaviors influenced by features of one's immediate situation. And those features of one's situation are not in themselves of moral significance. They might not be of great motivational significance. And we might not even know or be aware of the fact that these aspects of our situations, like a general environment, might be helping us. So a lot of the philosophical literature has noticed this fact, has drawn upon experimental psychology and said, look, if it's true that situations influence us in these ways, we should seek those situations that really support the kind of behavior we want. And I think this is like a very kind of popular idea, right? You put yourself in situations to succeed. You put yourself in situations where you're liable to act well, and you avoid situations that you act poorly in, right? So that kind of strategy has dominated a lot of the discussion in Western philosophical approaches. But that strategy, okay, to me, is like animated by just to focus on one root of influence, that is influence from our situations to us. But what's fascinating to me, and this is like the single point I wanted to kind of drive home, is that these early thinkers noticed this other thing, that not only do situations influence our own behavior, but we as people are constantly influencing the behavior of other people in our situations. It's just a sort of a corollary of that general principle that situations affect our behavior, that we're influencing our situations too, right? So if you're prone to be, say, excited or annoyed in the presence of another person, then other people might be excitable or annoyed in your presence, right? And they're being influenced by you just as much as you're being influenced by them. So in classical Confucianism, there's this term that is just devoted to describing this. It's called de, and it's variously translated as influence or power or sway or just virtue. But de is this ability that we have that we weld over other people just by being around them. So it kind of describes your vibe as a human being and then how you influence the people around you. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, for any of us to know what our de is. Like, it's not something that we're subject to, right? It's something that other people feel in our presence. So here's this like fascinating concept to me when I read these texts. And there are passages that really kind of, I think, exaggerate the ability for de to influence other people, but it's an aspect of life that I think we tend to overlook. So look at this one passage. This is from the Analects, where the master, this is Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, one of the most influential humans in all of history. And he expresses this frustration with his failure to reform the society of his time. And he says he desires now to go live among the 90 barbarian tribes. And then one of his peers asks him, like, how could you bear with their uncouth behavior to leave civilization and go out to this uncivilized periphery? And he says, well, if a nobleman were to dwell among them, what uncouth behavior would there be? So there's this like powerful expression here that like how other people behave is a function of how you're treating them, is a function of how you are in their midst. And I think this is slightly exaggerated, but it captures, I think, this really important truth that we are always sort of subtly shaping how other people are feeling and reacting to us when we're in their midst. Another passage says that the de, this kind of like influence or potency of a nobleman is like wind, and the de of a petty person is like grass. And when the wind blows, the grass is sure to bend. So the basic idea here, am I out of time?
Here, so yeah, so the time is up.
Okay, so I'll just finish up this point then, and then we'll move on. So I think this has this real, I think, profound impact on the way that I view myself as a person And I try to be mindful of the fact that I influence others. And the case study that I was going to mention, see, I prepared way too many slides, is teaching. So to me, as a professor, as someone who's the focus of other people's attention just by a virtue of my job, it's very obvious to me that if I'm not excited, if I'm not interested, if I'm not expressing in who I am sort of passion about my discipline, I can't expect to influence others to be equally passionate. And so it's drawn me to sort of see how this kind of careful observation about human life and a notice about how influence works on it could have real import when it comes to my own behavior. So that's sort of the one thing that I wanted to draw your attention to. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. And now let's welcome Professor Saam Trivedi to the second talk.
Okay, thanks to Professors Campos, Lean, and Sarkisian, and all of you for joining us. Our topic is why study Asian philosophy? And I'm going to give you broadly 3 kinds of reasons with some examples why you should study Asian philosophy. Okay, the first thing I'm going to say is Asian philosophies are very rich and a lot of fun in and of themselves. They're philosophically very rich. Second thing I want to say, Asian philosophies might change your life in positive ways. And the third thing I want to talk about is other practical benefits, economic, cultural, etc., of studying Asian philosophies. So I'll give you some examples and illustrate all 3 points. Okay, so on the first point, Asian philosophies are philosophically very rich and a lot of fun, right? As you saw from what Professor Sarkisian said, there's a lot of ethics in classical Chinese philosophy, in the Confucians and the Mohists and legalists and others, right? There's a lot of ethics also in Indian philosophies. You'll find, for example, in the Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, there's a certain duty-based ethics, somewhat like Kant's ethics. The Buddhists and Jains, other Indian traditions also have a lot of ethics, okay? There's also a lot of metaphysics in Asian philosophies, a study of reality, right? For example, there's a school of thought in Indian philosophy called the Vaisheshika tradition. They are pluralists about the nature of reality. There are fundamentally many kinds of things, many categories. They also happen to be atomists, right? The Buddhists have a process ontology of the kind that you might find in the great ancient Greek pre-Socratic thinker Heraclitus, the idea that everything is changing, everything is in flux, nothing is constant. There's also a lot of epistemology, a theory of knowledge in Asian philosophies. Just to give you a couple of quick examples, within Indian philosophy, you'll find the Nyaya tradition that holds there are 4 means of knowledge. Okay, I won't go into these unless they come up in Q&A. Okay, the Charvak tradition, which is an atheist materialist tradition within Indian philosophy, is an empiricist tradition. They make a lot of claims like David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. Okay. One more thing I'll mention, many contemporary ideas in Western philosophy, in contemporary Western philosophy, have older parallels in Asian philosophy. So I'll give you just one example. There's a lot of talk of panpsychism these days in the philosophy of mind. You'll find an analog of this, for example, in the ancient Hindu text, the Upanishads, which talk about the notion of Brahman. Brahman is the ground of all things. It's the universal self or the supreme spirit. There's a similar idea in Chinese Buddhism, perhaps derived to some degree from Taoism. It's the idea of Buddha nature, the idea that everything has a potential to be enlightened, become Buddha. So that's my first point. Asian philosophies are philosophically very rich and a lot of fun. Okay. My second point also ties in neatly with what Professor Sarkisian said. Asian philosophies might change your life in positive ways. Okay. A lot of Asian philosophy is meant to impact your life, meant to change your experience. It's not just purely abstract. And in this respect, it's like a lot of ancient Greek philosophy, right? If you read the Stoics, the Epicureans, Aristotle, that's meant to change your life. Around the same time, people in China and India and elsewhere are saying similar things, right? If you read Confucius, there are ideas about virtue being a mean between extremes of excess and vice, very much like as in Aristotle, as Professor Sarkisian was saying. The Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, talks about being even-tempered. If you're the kind of person who gets mad very easily, and I know people like that, I actually know philosophers like that, right? It might help you to study Asian philosophy. It might change your life, make you sort of be more in the middle, right? But the Buddhists likewise talk about a middle path between extreme sensual indulgence and self-mortification. So Asian philosophies might change your life in positive ways, have a good impact on you. That's my second point. And my third and last point about other practical benefits, economic, cultural, etc., right? China, Japan, India are amongst the 5 or 6 largest economies in the world today in terms of GDP, gross domestic product. I had a business major some years back who took my class in Asian philosophy. He said to me, you want to study Asian philosophy because you want to go into business in China. and he wanted to learn about Asian cultures, Asian philosophies, Asian histories, languages, and he thought this class would be very useful for him. And he's exactly right, right? China has the world's second largest economy today. Japan has the third largest economy in the world today. India has the fifth largest economy in the world today. So these countries matter and will matter throughout the 21st century economically. Also, in terms of population, and this is my last point, China and India have the world's largest populations today. China has 1.4 billion people. India has also 1.4 billion. There was a projection earlier this year from the UN, I believe, that next year, India's population will exceed that of China's, okay? We, the United States, we have the third largest population in the world today, about 340 million people. Indonesia, another Asian country, has the fourth largest population in the world today. Pakistan, another Asian country, has the fifth largest population in the world today. So in terms of practical benefits in the near and long-term future in the 21st century, it's going to be helpful to learn about Asian cultures, histories, philosophies, languages. It may have economic and cultural benefits for you. So I guess I want to conclude with this. Our topic is why study Asian philosophy? I guess in light of what Professor Sarkis and I have said, maybe we should ask, why should we not study Asian philosophy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Trivedi and Professor Sarkisian. So now we begin our Q&A session. So I'll be the one to take the cues. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll take you on my note. And also because all of your name will conveniently display on the screen, I'm just going to take the liberty of referring to everyone by their first name, if that is okay. Thank you. So hands.
I'll just note that there is a question in the chat and a really interesting discussion, but Elaine asked, I can see how Confucianism, as Confucius' advice on the correct way of living, can be considered a kind of philosophy, but aren't Hinduism and Buddhism religions? So I wonder if maybe we can start with that.
Okay, I can address that. They are religions, but they're also philosophies. Within the Hindu tradition, you will find that there are 6 different schools, sometimes called orthodox schools, okay? It's very hard to define what a Hindu is, but on one definition of what a Hindu is someone who accepts the Vedas, these ancient texts, as a source of knowledge. Okay, the non-Hindu traditions that arose in India, Buddhists most notably, but also Jains and Charvaks, they reject the Vedas as a source of knowledge. Now, within that division, within the Hindu tradition, there are 6 schools of philosophy, okay? There is the Nyaya tradition within the Hindu schools of philosophy, which is very much focused on epistemology, or theory of knowledge, and logic, very much like a lot of contemporary Western analytic philosophy, okay? There is the Sankhya tradition, which has a dualistic metaphysics, which basically subscribes to there being both matter and consciousness, Purusha and Prakriti, these are the terms. And yoga is another tradition, which actually is related to Sankhya, tells you the means of liberation, right? There is the Vaisheshika tradition, which I mentioned very briefly, which is pluralist and atomist. So there are different schools of philosophizing within the Hindu tradition. Within the Buddhist tradition also, there are philosophies. For example, if you look at the great Mahayana Buddhist tradition, one of the greatest philosophers of Buddhist philosophy, in fact, arguably the greatest Buddhist philosopher ever after the Buddha himself, is a philosopher called Nagarjuna, who lived in the 2nd century CE. And he is philosophizing, he's talking about the nature of reality, being always changing and being interconnected. So there are philosophical ideas in there, even though, yes, these are both religions too, Hinduism and Buddhism. Yep.
Jakob, would you like to add something to these questions as well, or?
Yeah,
share.
I'll just say briefly that, I mean, Confucianism can also be taken as a religion. And, you know, in its classical origins it consists of ancestor worship and has with it a number of the features of religion, including rituals, you know, sacred ceremonies that you have to perform at various times of the year, and that are built around important life events like many religions have. So rituals concerning birth and marriage, and for Confucians, especially mourning rituals, which they thought were extremely important in dealing with the upheaval of emotion that we all experience at the passing of a loved one. So to me, like, sometimes it's just what I look for is like reflective and illuminating observations on the human condition. And to me, as a philosopher, like what you want to label the text that has these observations is of secondary importance. Like it could be interesting to engage in those discussions about what aspects do we want to call religious, which one's philosophical. But I think one of the great joys of working in a philosophy department is that you can draw inspiration from any of these texts. And it's not as though I, as a philosopher, have to, acknowledge certain disciplinary boundaries in terms of what the source material of my philosophizing has to be. I can draw inspiration from a poem. I can draw inspiration from a sacred text. I can draw inspiration from pop culture. And so to me, it's the nature of the reflections, how illuminating they are, how probing they are, and then like whether or not they have some application to improve us as individuals or to have some like pragmatic benefits in society. So I acknowledge the question. I think that it's like a very fair question to ask, like, what aren't these religions, aren't these philosophies? But I think like you could take an approach to these texts, which will draw from it these insights that you want. And then I think these other questions, at least for me, tend to recede into the background a little bit. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I would say to it.
So Elaine, would you like to follow up on this point, or shall we go to our next question? If you're here. Oh, okay. So she's unable to use her mic. All right. So any other questions for our speakers?
If we have time, I'd love to hear what our moderator has to say about these questions too. But I'm happy to defer to other questions in the meantime. But that would be great for me, at least.
Actually, me too, because she has to leave early. So Jolene, maybe just before you leave, if you would like to say something, that'd be great.
Yes. Oh, thank you very much. I just realized that I haven't even introduced myself and just kind of shamelessly inserted myself in this occasion without telling everybody who I am. So I'm Jolene. I'm also doing my PhD at, I did my PhD at Duke, like Hagop. And I didn't start my PhD trying to do Chinese philosophy, despite knowing that Duke is a fantastic place to do non-Western philosophy. So I actually had two different research programs. So one is the history and philosophy of modern science, and the other is Chinese philosophy, especially Chinese Islamic philosophy. So what drew me into Asian philosophy was, first and foremost, I did most of my, I did my pre-college education in China. So as a Chinese high schoolers, you were required to memorize a lot of classical texts. But there was this one day I realized that although I have memorized a lot of those texts from Confucius, from Zhuangzi, I didn't really understand much of what they were saying. Like, I have all the memory of the text, but I don't have but I never apply any analytic tool to them. And now that I came to Duke, I'm a Chinese analytic philosophy. I thought it would be the great occasions to try to delve into those texts and see whether they have something interesting to offer. So that was how I started to do Asian philosophy. It was because I really wanted to understand those very obscure texts that I had a very good memory of, but never a very good understanding of. Just kind of a matter of curiosity. And the second motivations that drew me into Chinese Islamic philosophy is even more, is more of a personal relevance. So I have families who belongs to the Hui ethnic groups. So the Hui people, they committed to Islam as their religion. And they also had a very established history of settling in China. They immigrated into China since more than 1,000 years ago. So there was this one day I wondered to myself whether, having settled in China for this many years, do the Hui people ever contributed anything philosophically relevant to the Chinese, intellectual landscape? And just this very simple question that I had with my family on the dinner table led me to the discovery of this very rich and fascinating tradition, Islamic philosophical traditions that's indigenous to China. So it turns out that in the 17th century, there were a group of the Hui scholars were trying to start this, this tradition, which was later called the Han Kitab, the Chinese book, where they were trying to use a lot of terminology from the Chinese philosophical tradition, from Taoism, from Confucianism, to articulate what they regard as the true meaning of Islam. So this was just a very kind of serendipity, I would say, to maybe realize that, wow, like Confucianism and Taoism on the one hand and Islam on the other, they were so different. But in the 17th century in China, there were already people trying to do what we regard as comparative philosophy today, trying to integrate them and to identify where their exact conflicts are and what are the possibilities of bringing them into dialogue. So that just, this kind of almost a aha moment for me that led me to start this research project on Chinese Islamic philosophy. So the figure that I'm working on right now is Wang Daiyu. So he was the first and the foundational figure in this whole Chinese philosophical, Chinese Islamic philosophical tradition. He's the one who, his most important work was published in 1642, so 2 years before Descartes' philosophy, Principle of Philosophy. So he's kind of an early modern, if you will, in the Chinese chronology. And so in this book, he doesn't just give us a whole systematic articulation of the Islamic metaphysics, but also epistemology and and some of his ethical views, right? Most of which consist in his criticism of Confucianism. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this figure because although his work had been translated into English since 2010, there is zero philosophical articles being written about him. So that was really a great shame that philosophers were not paying enough attention to this Islamic figure. So I'm hoping that through my work and also others, we can bring him more to the forefront. And my ambition was to try to bring him into one of the Chinese, philosophy anthology, where we will have Islamic sections for this distinct philosophical tradition. So that's about me. We have questions from Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry I had to jump in so late, but I'm glad I caught this. One question is, do you mind just putting the person, especially since you said it's in translation, do you mind putting their name into the chat so I can just make sure the search is easier for it? Because you said there is an English translation of some of this philosopher's work. So did I hear you correctly? And then I am curious, so this Islamic philosophy you refer to, is it largely drawing on, for instance, Avicenna, and one of the reasons I'm curious about that is I'm curious about the kind of transmission, perhaps, of a Platonic Aristotelian line of thinking into further east than I'm used to imagining it going. So that just a sort of informational question, if I may.
Yes. So far we know very little about this figure. We know very little about what text he had access to while he was writing. And we didn't know exactly where he got his teachings from. But the only things that religious scholars are very certain of is that Chinese Islamic thinkers tend to draw from Sufism. So it's a very particular strand in Islam. And so, for instance, they inherited from Sufism this Neoplatonist, emanative frameworks of metaphysics. So they think that all the realities will kind of emanate from the real one, God, through the Muhammadan spirits, right? The first things that God creates. So science like this would kind of very clear that the primary source they draw from is Sufism. Although we don't know whether he had access to figures like Avicenna.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Daniel?
Yeah, I'll defer to students if they want to jump in with questions, but while they get the courage to ask, Saam and maybe Hago and Cho want to add. So one of the reasons Saam give for studying Asian philosophy is the fact that these philosophies are alive in contemporary culture. So if you want to, if you're a non-Asian person that wants to, for practical or personal reasons, interact with the cultures, you might want to learn. So just a bit of your sense of how alive these philosophies really are in the respective cultures, like how we might see them at work.
So yeah, I'm happy to take a quick stab at that. I mean, so I think it's almost a sort of a reductive claim that Chinese culture is just a Confucian through and through. So I'll just describe my experience. So as someone who, like my bread and butter is reading these texts from like 2,500 years ago. And then, during my PhD years, I would start like looking at like journals in like psychology and looking at comparative psychology and cultural psychology. And then like, I would see that these participants in these surveys like talk about like questions that I'm interested in as a philosopher, like about what the moral domain consists of, or like what sort of things are most relevant to the moral life. And like, it was just really striking to me how much like what these psychologists were observing and writing up just as like pure observational work about like what lay populations in like Korea or in Taiwan or in China were like expressing as important considerations. Like, I had a slide I didn't have a chance to share, which is like being mindful of your impact on other people and making sure that people feel comfortable to express themselves in a group setting so that they don't feel as though, they don't matter. So that was described as an important feature of moral life. And that's like this like really kind of like core commitment in early Confucianism, that like what rituals enable is it enables people to sort of like participate with one another as full participants in a community. So like, it was just like odd to me. Like I'm reading these philosophical texts and I'm reading these like psychology texts from like today, and they're very much, in harmony with one another. And, Xi Jinping has oftentimes quoted Confucian teachings, and his personal sort of philosophical hero is this neo-Confucian thinker named Wang Yangming, and he has like really quoted him a lot in terms of like being a figure whose philosophy ought to like inform the population today. Now, whether or not what you think about Xi Jinping is like a separate question, but like the question about like whether or not this is like important to know and has like contemporary relevance, it very much does. And I think so. That to me is like the obvious kind of first thing that comes to my mind, is that like that one area that I work a lot in, Confucianism, is like a live tradition today. It's debated today amongst academics in China. It's like a source of inspiration for various important figures in Chinese society. And so in that sense, I think like coming to know this tradition really does, I think, help one to just like understand broadly and have cultural competence in, this kind of contemporary world.
Yeah, I'll say very similar things with reference to India. Hinduism has shaped India in many ways that are alive even today, no matter what your political leanings be. And again, I'm not going to talk much about the political regime in India, but leaving that to one side, if you look even at the non-Hindu schools of philosophy, like Buddhism and Jainism, they're actually responding to Hindu traditions. They're rejecting the Vedas as a source of knowledge. They're rejecting animal sacrifice, which you find in the Vedas. They're rejecting the caste system, okay? So you could actually see these movements, Buddhism and Jainism, as kind of more like, they start off as kind of like reform movements. And you find politicians in India quoting from the Bhagavad Gita, including the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And this actually goes back at least as far back as Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the nation, father of India, as he's called. He often used to quote from the Bible and from Tolstoy and from the Bhagavad Gita. So certainly it's true that these traditions have shaped cultures that go back thousands of years and are very much alive in that respect. Yep.
Yeah, so for me, I would say just two things. So one is that the first time I TA for Chinese philosophy course, I can see how students were just very enthusiastic about this. We never have difficulty recruiting students at Duke when Chinese philosophy is offered. You can see that there is this very urgent need, this curiosity to learn about other cultures among the students. In fact, we have a lot of students coming in who are Asian Americans themselves. would express that they really come here to understand why they are brought up in certain ways. And they often came out of the class telling us that they know their family, they know some of the values that their family uphold better after taking this class. And the second thing is just that philosophy is weird. Like a lot of the things that we find in philosophy is weird. Sometimes we will find, sometimes we can find even weirder things in systems that were less familiar to us. Like, so for instance, in the Chinese Islamic philosophy, there is this view that everything around us was just emanation of God. Like, so when I first saw this, I think to myself, like, who would think this way? Who would think that we are just the lights that God emanates? What are these people thinking? What is going on? And how can they possibly defend such a weird view, right? So a lot of the time it's just really curiosity, and just to satisfy the curiosity that constitute my answers as to why I study Asian philosophy, because it's there, it's weird. Yeah.
There's some good questions in the chat.
Oh, great. So shall we turn to Erickson from the chat? If you'd like to and able to speak, please do. Erickson?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to ask because we were speaking on, Chinese philosophy, also Indian philosophy. We're delving into the ideas of Buddhist philosophy. Is there any like other Asian countries or regions that you think there's like valuable philosophy in as well, like for example, like Oceanasia, like Indonesia, maybe Mongolia, even up to Russia. Is there any other type of philosophy that you think are of similar value in what you both were respectively talking about in terms of like our capacity to broaden our understanding of philosophy in general, not just from a Western perspective, but like encompassing all of, I guess, in quotes, Eastern philosophy, if that makes sense.
Okay, I can go first. I mean, there's Japanese philosophy, very obviously, but if you turn to Southeast Asia, there's a kind of Buddhism called engaged Buddhism. That's perhaps most famously associated with the monk Thich Nhat Hanh. Okay, so that's very valuable. Korean philosophy, which I have to admit I don't know too much about, but I gather there's a lot of Confucianism in there, which I think Hagor Cholin might know more about. So yes, there are other traditions, certainly within Asia, that are at least as valuable, if not more so, as Chinese or Indian philosophy.
Yes, I mean, I can echo that. I'm delighted that this semester, for the first time at Baruch, we are offering a course on Japanese philosophy. The Korean tradition is also very rich. Once we get outside of that sphere of influence of East Asia, then, I must sort of admit my ignorance, and I'm sure there are texts out there that I just remain unaware of outside of them. But certainly those three traditions have long-standing engagement, not only having like indigenous local philosophical movements, but also like reacting to the philosophies of neighboring civilizations, which I think is fascinating.
So I'm going to read questions from Elaine on the chat because she is unable to speak through the mic, and then we're going to Nika's question. So Elaine asked, it is true that these philosophies have lasting effects in this Asian society through history and current day, but isn't the reductive grouping of all these individual, I think maybe Hagov already answered this question. But isn't it to grouping all these individual scholars and philosophers under the same umbrella term as Hinduism and Confucianism? And Elaine goes on, she says, in other words, is it possible to teach a class of Asian philosophy in the same way as a class of Western philosophy through individuals, or is Hinduism really so persuasive in their cultures that we can learn about current mindsets solely through religious texts like the Vedas? So either of you who wants to answer these questions from Elaine, please go ahead.
I think it's fair to say that Hinduism has dominated Indian culture and philosophy the way Confucianism has dominated Chinese philosophy and culture over the last 2,500 years. But that being said, yes, you also, discuss other texts and other traditions. So I certainly talk about the Buddhists and the Jains. When I talk about Indian philosophy, you can't ignore them. They're responding to Hinduism. They're rejecting some central Hindu tenets, whether they pertain to ethics or metaphysics or certain texts. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say it's reductionist. And you can certainly, let me take an analogy. When you study ancient Greek philosophy, you have to do Plato and Aristotle, but you would also cover some of the pre-Socratics, you'd cover the Stoics, you'd cover the Epicureans, the skeptics. But Plato and Aristotle would kind of be essential in some ways, right? And other people are responding to them. They responded to Aristotle, the Hellenistic philosophers, for example. Similarly, I would say both in Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy, the other philosophers are often responding to Confucianism and Taoism on the one hand, in the Chinese case, and in the Indian case to Hinduism and also Buddhism to some degree. There's the Charvak tradition, which I mentioned briefly, which rejects even ideas of reincarnation and rebirth. It's the only school of philosophy in ancient India that reject rebirth and reincarnation. All the others, including the Buddhists and Jains and the Hindus, of course, accept that. So I think maybe it's not entirely fair to say it's reductionist. But I'll stop.
Yeah. I like your, so I wasn't sure how to answer the reductive question, Elaine, but I really liked your second question, which is like, is it possible to teach class on Asian philosophy in the same way that is through focus through individuals? And I think that's what you'll find in Training course. Like, we deal with these individuals as thinkers in their own right. And one thing that you would learn, say, if you took a course in classical Chinese philosophy, is all these labels are labels that later Chinese historians come up to group these early thinkers based on shared tendencies or shared focus, same conceptual schemes that they're using. But like, Confucius didn't know he was a Confucian. Like, Mencius didn't know he was a Confucian. Zhuangzi didn't know he was a Taoist. These are terms that later Chinese historians came up with when they're looking back at this like classical period and like noticing the richness of activity as part of their like effort to analyze and to study and to pass on what these thinkers thought. They grouped them into various. So in my class, like, I have very strong opinions about whether these people, to what extent they're Confucian, or like how that label even makes sense for some of them. And I think that those are like interesting and rich questions. Like, for the purposes of a session like today, I'll use that term very loosely to talk about what were Confucians interested in. But just that one idea I was talking about, like this idea of like personal influence, like that varies greatly across thinkers about how much they're preoccupied with it, or to what extent they think it's ethically relevant and so forth. So I think you will find that if you take classes, it's not simply, oh, here's what Confucianism is about. It's like, oh, like, here's what like this one person, Mencius, who lived in the 4th century, like had to say about these topics and how he saw himself and like what his position was relative to his contemporaries. So it's very much like a let's think about what these thinkers were writing about, what we're preoccupied with, and these labels can just come and go. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Okay, so we have Nika. Nika, please.
Hello, everybody. I just have a quick question regarding the subject matter and methodology used. So it seems to me that the separation between Eastern and Western philosophy is insurmountable when it comes to subject matter and methodology. And on these grounds, is this separation necessary and justified, or are they two philosophies compatible at all?
I think it's easy to exaggerate the differences. So you mentioned two things, method and subject matter. So I think like in terms of like what they're focusing on, the particular concepts they're using, there's surely going to be differences. In terms of subject matter, there's like extreme overlap. So I think that, they're oftentimes reacting to like very stable and persistent and sometimes irresolvable conflicts in human society. And so they're reflecting on like similar problems of how to integrate certain broad values, say the value of like freedom with the value of obligations and owing something to society. So I think in terms of topic and also in terms of method, I mean, these thinkers are coming up with arguments for their position. They're not just sort of stating them and not supporting them with any forms of reasoning. So yes, it's true that the form of the philosophy will sometimes look different. They're not always discursive essays that we might be used to from the Western tradition. Some of them are told to stories or allegories, but it doesn't take long to figure out, okay, what is the conclusion here, and what are the reasons I'm being presented with to accept the conclusion that this thinker wants me to accept. And so in terms of that, like, I also see like great overlap in method. And so, sometimes even to the fact that here's just like an argumentative essay meant to establish a conclusion. And here are the reasons, and here's the conclusion. And just like any argument, you can go through premise by premise, question whether or not they're true, whether or not they're reasonable, and whether one follows from the other. So in terms of like reasons in support of conclusion and justification and all these things that we think are part of what it is to do the like method of philosophy, I think it's all there, Nika. So fair question, but I think it's easy to overstate the differences.
I agree with Hagop on this. There are points of similarity and points of differences. You'll find both, and I'll give you some examples of similarities beyond the ones I mentioned earlier. You'll find that there are logicians in these other traditions. Okay, so the Buddhists have their own logic, which they developed through Nagarjuna later, Dinag and Dharmakirti, logicians like that. The Nyaya school of Indian philosophy, which I mentioned, they have their own syllogism. In Aristotle, you'll find a 3-step deductive argument called a syllogism. You'll find a 5-step syllogism in the Nyaya school of Indian philosophy. There are logicians in China. There's a school of names, which lights and paradoxes about the white horse, for example, right, which Hago will know more about than I do. So there are points of similarity. There are also points of difference. But I think something else we should remember is a lot of Western philosophy. Sometimes people say Eastern philosophy, Asian philosophy is all mystical, Western philosophy is all rational. That's painting with very broad brushstrokes. You'll find rationalist traditions in Eastern or Asian philosophies. You'll also find mystical traditions in Western philosophy. You read Meister Eckhart or some other medieval philosophers. There's a lot of mystical experience, religious experience is very important for them. So you'll find points of similarity and points of dissimilarity also. And I think Professor Sarkisian is right. Sometimes people exaggerate or overstate the differences. Daniel, you want to moderate this point since Jolene had to leave?
Yes, I'll moderate, see if there are more questions. I'll read a comment from Elaine, though I think we lost her presence right now in the meeting, but I think she raised an interesting point for those of us who teach Asian philosophy or in general. She said, like Professor Sarkisian said, his position as a teacher is very powerful. The topics you choose in your class will be how your students learn to view those Asian cultures. It's strange to me that we're learning a religion to learn philosophy when this is not the case in Western philosophy. So maybe we can elaborate a little bit on this relationship between East and West and whether the differences are exaggerated sometimes or not. I don't know if you wanna.
I guess if Elaine was here,
Mm-hmm.
I would sort of want to clarify that, like, students in my class aren't learning a religion because that's not my discipline, and I'm not well equipped to teach these texts as religious texts. Like, I don't consider them religious texts. I don't give a religious reading to them, whatever that means. So, my discipline is philosophy. I'm a trained philosopher, and I read these texts like I read any other text. And so, that's the one thing that I think we can get hung up on. Like, sure, you can read Confucianism as a religion, and and I said that it is a religion in the sense that it consists of ancestor worship as part of its rituals. So I grant all of that. But in my classroom as a philosophy teacher, I'm not teaching religion. What I'm doing is I'm teaching the writings of thinkers, and I try to illuminate exactly why they're relevant, and to teach them as philosophy as I would sort of like any other text. But I guess, like, Elaine, I'm curious to see what other people, look, there's definitely like a cohesion to the thoughts that Elaine is expressing, and maybe she's worried that, like, in just using these labels at all, like, will be priming students to think that they're learning about traditions and not thinkers. And, like, I think that that's a fair worry as so far as it goes. And I think, I'd just be very surprised if you look at the textbooks that are available now in early China and so forth. Like, they're written like you would read any sort of introductory textbook that would cover great figures in the history of philosophy. And these labels, I think, aren't emphasized, nor is the idea that, you're learning about a religion, at least if you take these courses in a philosophy department, like you can at Brooklyn and you can at Baruch, for example.
Yeah, I'll add to that very quickly because I see Andrew has a question. When I read selections from these texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, yes, they are religious texts, but I read them like a philosopher. I assess them critically, okay? I raise questions of them the way I would when I read Plato or Aristotle or Descartes or Hume or Kant or Quine, for that matter. In fact, it's interesting that within Indian philosophy, for example, to go back to that, the kind of questions are raised within Indian philosophy by the Charvak tradition, the non-Hindu tradition, which rejects reincarnation, which is atheist, materialist, hedonist, empiricist, a lot like David Hume's views, a lot like a lot of contemporary Australian philosophers in many ways. So I certainly am not teaching religion or religiosity. I'm looking at texts which could be taken as religious texts, but in a way that's critical, that's philosophical. I ask questions about ethics or metaphysics or epistemology or logic. That's what I do. Yeah.
Andrew?
I was just going to actually, one thing is Elaine's actually my student, so I can talk to her a little bit more about this. But and I think I know where she's coming from a little bit, but I won't try to tell you here. But one interesting thing about her comment is that arguably, we who are teaching Western philosophy should do a lot more to contextualize it within its religious cultural matrix, right? And I can imagine if I were teaching my courses, especially medieval courses in, say, China, that I would probably have to do a lot of back and fill about the Christian kind of assumptions and framework that's sort of just in the water and in the background of many of these robust philosophical discussions. I'll also just sort of chime in and say that especially the history of medieval philosophy is a place where religion and philosophy do kind of intersect in ways that make it sometimes hard to disentangle. And for that reason, I think often medieval has been overlooked because of a certain kind of Enlightenment way in which we now do the so-called history of Western philosophy. So anyway, I mean, I think Elaine's points are very intriguing for that reason, in that they do remind us that, philosophies aren't done in vacuums, and that the people who are writing these, even someone like Hume, right, who's notoriously, or people thought he was an atheist, right? He's he's working within a milieu, and he's making certain kinds of cases precisely because he's in a Christian Protestant milieu that he wouldn't have been making and wouldn't have taken for granted if he were coming from a different background.
I will note we have colleagues from LaGuardia, from Staten Island, and from BMCC. So this is a very nice, also CUNY conversation. I wonder if any of our colleagues want to say something about their experiences teaching Asian philosophy. You don't have to, but since we have you here.
I actually had a question. I'm Pyle. I teach at LaGuardia Community College. And my question is, how do you get students to enroll in your classes and run them regularly? I teach Eastern philosophy at LaGuardia, and I can barely get 12 students in the class every other semester, because they're very focused on graduating with their degree, and it's counted as one of our pathways classes, right? A bucket class. So I'm curious, what do you do for outreach, or do you really just have a plethora of students like beating down the doors to your classes, in which case, please tell me your secret.
Ago, you should go first.
I must admit, I have no particular insight, and that's because I've been extremely fortunate since the moment I got at Baruch that I haven't had to overcome this hurdle. So it could be that we have a lot of students of East Asian heritage at Baruch, some like 4 out of 10 maybe. So I think that, the issue I have is a lot of them come in thinking that they understand these thinkers because of their heritage, and then challenging them on their understanding of these thinkers is, I think, the kind of obstacle that I have. But I'll defer to others in terms of like strategies, because I've just been fortunate in that regard and haven't had that challenge.
In my case, we used to have something called an upper tier core here at Brooklyn College for many years. And one of the classes that was part of the upper tier course was a class called Classical Philosophy of India and China. And that was very popular because it was kind of like a requirement. So there was a time we could offer like 5 sections in a given semester and they would run. But then sadly, the upper tier kind of vanished. Not clear to me exactly why that happened. So I think one of the ways to, I don't have a secret, but I think one of the things to do is to have events like this and have students come to them and expose them. Look, I mean, you're not just reading religion, there's actually philosophy in here, whether it's the Chinese tradition, the Japanese, or the Southeast Asian or Islamic or Hindu or some of the traditions. So I think that's one way to do it, but I don't think that's a complete answer to your question.
I'll just say a few words, if I can, because I'm the director of the East Asian Studies program, and we have the same problem, in terms of filling it, especially Asian philosophy courses, or not only Asian philosophy courses, but in my experience. So I think there's no easy answer for us, other than we have an international studies center that recruits people for study abroad, so we can sort of tap into them, and you tend to find populations of students who'd be interested and open to courses like Asian philosophy, East Asian philosophy. We have various student societies around the college, sort of Japanese Culture Appreciation Society, Asian American group. And again, so dialoguing directly with them tends to bring in some students. But, and one other thing is, because we have an East Asian Studies minor, you can bring students in as part of getting the minor and bring them into these Asian philosophy classes while also doing classes in Asian history or whatever it may be. Yeah, no easy answer as far as I can see.
Right. Well, thank you. I think I kind of chalk it up to partly just being a community college where the students are super directed to get over to their 4 years. But yeah, I appreciate it. I was also curious, are you all collaborating with RE and any other groups to try to create an Asian American Studies program? Or is that something you feel is out of the wheelhouse of Asian philosophy?
Our courses are cross-listed with that program here at Baruch. So that was something that was here when I got here. So we always have students who sign up under that section. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, Saam.
We have an Asian Studies program. We also have an Asian American Studies program. So there's a kind of a divide, if you like, between Asian Studies and Asian American Studies. Okay, and they're both, I think at this point, probably our Asian American Studies program is bigger than our Asian Studies program. But when I was first hired, it was the other way around. So I think things just change. Depends on, who's in charge, who's running what. Yeah. But go ahead, Daniel, you were going to say something.
Yeah, not just that. We do have both of those programs, and I think part of the purpose of having brought this conversation together is also to think about ways in which we can collaborate to make the study of Asian philosophy attractive and viable for our students across CUNY. So I'm not sure there are easy answers, but I'm glad that we are all having this conversation, and I hope we can continue it. We're done with time, so maybe if Saam and Hago want to give a 1-minute conclusion, and then we'll finish. And thank you everybody for being here.
I'll just say I'm easily Googleable, and if you have further questions, I'm always happy to discuss. Further about how meaningful it's been for me as just as an individual to have engaged with Asian philosophical traditions for the last, I won't say how long, but quite a long time, and happy to follow up with any of you things.
Yeah, I'm just going to say thanks very much for organizing this. Thanks to Daniel, especially for suggesting this idea to me early in the fall, and for all the help that you've given me. And thanks to Hago and Jolene and all of you. I guess I don't have any conclusion except to say, do come and explore Asian philosophy. There's a very famous quote from someone. The mind is like a parachute. It works only when open. Okay, it's often attributed to Frank Zappa, but I suspect it's actually older. That's very true. You know, there's a lot to learn from Western philosophy, from religions, but you'll be surprised. Study Asian philosophy, for that matter, study Islamic philosophy, study Native American philosophy, feminist philosophy. You know,